So that's a new thing. Can you guys hear that when it says that? But it's so weird when I make a recording, like a video on Zoom, it doesn't show up on, like, it won't be on the recording itself, but it doesn't like let me speak. It's very strange. I have to like start a video and then say, and then like shalom, and then start talking. So, any case, I don't really think that matters to anybody. Okay. Okay, let's start off with questions. Nothing really happened in Israel in the news this week, so let's see if you have any general questions. Okay, Hodaya.
It's not a question. I just want to share with you, Rabbi, that I actually met over Shabbos. I met Nikki Haley and Pastor Hagee. I'm not sure if you know Pastor Hagee, but I met Nikki.
I know Pastor Hagee very well. Yes.
Yeah, it was amazing. She's super nice. I just wanted to share that.
That's very cool. Okay, because she took Odaya, just for anybody who knows, we always hint about this, but Odaya's father is actually the VIP tour guide. He does more than that, but I call him the VIP tour guide. You shouldn't think of him as like the tour guide from your TJJ bus. Okay, it's a lot more important of a position. But not that there's anything wrong with the TJJ tour guides on the buses, but he's not like the guy with the brim hat and like telling you like, you know, with the thing or whatever. He's a very important person. But he does it only for the city of David. So when dignitaries come in, one of the places that the Israeli government wants everybody to see is the city of David, because that shows the connection the Jews have to the land of Israel for the last 4,000 years, or 3,000 years, I should say. So so he'll show you artifacts. He'll walk you through King David's palace. And he's amazing at it. My biggest complaint against Hodaya is that she doesn't always accompany her father at every one of these tours, because her father knows every single person in Congress, basically, because they've all taken his tour of the city of David. So when Nikki Haley comes in, or Mike Pompeo when he was Secretary of State, so it's Zev Orenstein that takes them around. I think that's even cooler because Zev Orenstein is who he is because I was his dorm counselor when he was in yeshiva. And knowing that that's the greatest influence that anybody ever has on you in life is your dorm counselor. So clearly, Zev Orenstein only became Zev Orenstein, and to the point where his children are so wonderful only because of me. So that's why I'm like well aware of what he does. But that's very cool. Did you say anything to Nikki Haley?
Yeah, I actually spoke to her. She's really nice. So it was on Shabbos, so we stayed in Jerusalem over Shabbos because we don't live in Jerusalem, and then we walked to the old city, the city of David, and then when my dad introduced, like, is a big group, so my dad gave a like short introduction, like about who I am, and then his daughter, and that's it. And then afterwards, like when everyone was starting to walk to start the tour, she actually came over to me personally, like, "Oh, it's really nice to meet you. My name is Nikki." And I was like, "What?" And then afterward, during the tour, she was just standing there, and I went over to her and we started talking, which was really cool.
That's very cool. Very, very cool. They are here with a group called KUFI, which is Christians United for Israel, which is this is the craziest thing. They now have 10 million members, okay? These are evangelical Christians, started in a church in San Antonio, Texas, which is where this Pastor Hagee lives. And about 35 years ago, Pastor Hagee, I think it was after Israel bombed the Iraq nuclear reactor, and the world was criticizing Israel for that. And Pastor Hagee said, like, that this is like the greatest thing that's ever happened. Like we just had this little tiny country take out the nuclear reactor for a country that clearly should not be having nuclear weapons. Why is Ronald Reagan criticizing them? He should be praising them. Why is the United Nations, putting out resolutions against them? And so Pastor Hagee started this thing where he went around and tried to find ways that he could support Israel. He found Rabbi Scheinberg, who's still the rabbi in San Antonio, Texas, who partnered with him, and then started an organization called Christians United for Israel, which scares a lot of people because they always think that there's some sort of agenda between Christians and Jews. If Christians are embracing Jews, there isn't. The first time, the way I found out about this organization is in 2007. Pastor Hagee spoke at APEC's policy conference. And he spoke, and if you guys want to see the speech, it's on YouTube. You can see this speech, and like he had no rabbis speak like evangelical pastors speak, okay? But he was saying things that like were so surprising to Jews. The Torah is true. He said that a bunch of times. He was saying how He listed off all the Jewish enemies that are no longer around, and talked to Ahmadinejad, who was then the president of Iran, and said that you too will hang on the gallows like your ancestor Haman, like Haman, for those that don't speak. So it was like really, it was really shocking. So everybody else there was very was like nauseous. I'm sorry, everybody else there was cheering. I was nauseous. Excuse me. I was the only one of 5,000 people in the room nauseous. And the reason I was nauseous is just because my rabbi was a Holocaust survivor, and had like drilled into me that Gentiles hate Jews, and like you can never trust it. And here, like it was a very like confusing thing. So I spent about a year and a half studying the evangelical faith's position on Judaism, and then went over it with my rabbi. It's pretty amazing. It takes a long time to explain, and it sounds like kind of, to me, it sounds irrational, but I trust them. And then as a funnier thing, when this Kufi started, so there was in one of the Gaza wars took place in Sacramento, California. There was a woman who unfortunately has passed away since. Her name is Ruth Brandt, and her son is one of the executives at AIPAC, and she's obviously very pro-Israel, and she wanted to have a rally in Sacramento, California, that would be pro-Israel. And she went around to all the temples and conservative synagogues. There's not really an Orthodox community there, and asked for them to do a rally, and they all were against Israel. And she's like, "This is crazy." So she went to the church, like the evangelical church, who agreed to sponsor the rally. Like, she couldn't get Jews to do this. She had to get Christians to do this. So she's get crazy. And the pastor there was a man by the name of Pastor Victor Stursky, who she really liked. And then she once met Pastor Hagee and said, "By the way, if you need a number two, like our pastor up in Sacramento," he's like, "Wait a minute, your pastor? Like, you're Jewish?" She's like, "Well, he's my if I'm a Jew and a Jew has to have a pastor, he's going to be my pastor. So he likes Israel, so you should take him." So he left his church and joined this organization. When Ruth Brandt passed away, her son asked me to officiate the funeral in San Francisco. So I flew out to San Francisco, and then her son asked, would it be a problem if this Pastor Stursky spoke? So I said, as long as he doesn't mention Jesus and he doesn't mention anything religious. I don't even want him reading like Tehillim in English. As long as he, then that's fine. So I said, he just has to speak about your mom, and that's it. So he did. And then we had to drive 90 minutes to Sacramento, and everybody thought it would be hilarious if the pastor gave the rabbi a ride. So we were in the car together and drove together, and really, until this day, we're very, very close friends. He's spoken to our students before. So in any case, so I do know the evangelicals, and that's what Pastor Hagee is here. He's brought a mission to Israel to support Israel now. And that's who Hodiah Spencer Shabbos with a bunch of evangelical Christians. So that's the idea. Okay. Does anybody have a question? I tend to ramble on a lot at just in these sessions usually, and that wasn't even a. Shlomi says that Pastor Stursky is one of the best speakers we've ever had at AIPAC. They are very energetic. He has books, by the way. He has a book like the 10 questions that every Zionist needs to know about evangelicals. You can get it on Amazon. So it pays to read it because it sets aside some of the fears. You did have, by the way, you should know, there's another evangelical, you probably know him, Mike Evans, who's also, he's like that tall guy that has the museum in downtown Yerushalayim with the thin mustache. So he wrote he's also an evangelical leader. He's actually halachically Jewish. He's also psychotic. I have to say he's absolutely psychotic, and I'll tell you why I think this. A big friend of Israel. But he spoke at the United States Embassy, had a party. I don't think it was actually I don't know who. No, he paid for it. And Mike Evans paid for it, and his museum paid for it. But a party a year after they opened the embassy in Jerusalem, and had a party commemorating it. Everybody that flew in for the embassy opening, not everybody, but a lot of people flew back in for this. And Mike Evans spoke. This is the Prime Minister of Israel was there, then was Bibi Netanyahu. And Ambassador Friedman was there, and somebody from the Trump administration was there. It was a big thing. And he spoke in the most uncomfortable speech about being beaten by his anti-Semitic father because he was Jewish. And we're all like, what? Why would your anti-Semitic father have beaten you if you're an evangelical leader today? And then a bunch of us, it clicked, he's Jewish. like the head of like one of the major evangelical leaders of America is actually Jewish. Like, and he says he's Jewish. Like, it's very weird. So he's very weird. And he talked about like getting beaten and being abused. And like, these aren't things that you talk about in a speech, but like in great detail, not like I'm a survivor of abuse and then go on to talk about like the things that you've overcome and how, but like great detail having absolutely nothing to do with the subject matter. So it's like very like awkward type of a thing. So he wrote an op-ed after this new coalition was formed, which is probably something we should speak about. He wrote an op-ed that is like the definition of psychotic. It used like sexual imagery, and it talked about how he had a dream in 1981, a prophetic dream from God that Bibi 1981 that Bibi Netanyahu was going to be prime minister, and he told Menachem Begin, and Menachem Begin believed his prophetic dream from God, and therefore appointed Bibi Netanyahu as the deputy ambassador to the United Nations. And that's why Menachem Begin did it, because he did it. And now Israel is going against God's prophetic vision to him about Bibi Netanyahu being prime minister, and therefore he is going to work everything he has. He's going to put into destroying the enemies of the God of Israel. He's talking about Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, like just clear about who he's talking about. And this is like his definition of support of Israel is really means supporting his prophetic dream of what Israel should be. I've met this guy on a number of occasions, and every single time I get the creepy jeebies when I'm with him, okay? This like op-ed finished him off in Israel. Like he can never, like he's never going to be able to give a speech in Israel again. I mean, unless people didn't really read it enough. And like people forget about it, but you read this thing and you just look at it and you're like, this guy, he's like really crazy. Yeah, exactly, Shami. So that's that he's, I mean, like it really, but in any case, that's the evangelical that people don't want. But they don't realize that like Mike Evans and Pastor Hagee are two different people who have nothing to do with each other. So yes, except that they're both evangelical, but it's sort of like judging Judaism based on like a, like, I don't know, come up with one of 1,000 weird Jews you can think of now to fit the analogy. Okay, any questions? No one has any questions. Do you guys like follow the news? Jordan, go ahead.
Well, this is less about a current event. Though, was there any massacres, or I guess you probably have something to say about this, besides Deir Yassin?
Well, why do you think Deir Yassin was a massacre?
Right, I thought you were going to ask that. Because civilians were attacked.
How do you know?
Well, several sources say that, and not just Arab sources.
Right. So, okay. So what Jordan's talking about is in the 1948 war, the Independence War. So there's a lot of accusations made against Israeli soldiers of committing atrocities against civilians. Right. Now, Deir Yassin was an Arab village where supposedly what happened was that Israeli soldiers surrounded Deir Yassin. It was actually members of the Irgun who was. They weren't technically part of the Israeli army yet, but for all intents and purposes, and wiped out an entire village, men, women, and children. Okay. Now, if you hear it from the perspective of the Israeli soldiers that were there, they tell a much different story. They tell a story of how they announced beforehand that they were coming in, that everybody should retreat, that they should take out men, women, and children. And then when they arrived at the village, they were fired upon from every single house. In which case, there were no precision guided missiles then that you could take out, like a room in a building like you could like today. The only way to defend yourself in that case was to fire back, and you're supposed to, as a combatant, move your children out of the way. So they kept their children there, right? Now, so this is my personal view. Okay, my personal view is you have conflicting reports as to what happened in places like Deir Yassin and specifically Deir Yassin. You can read hundreds of reports from Deir Yassin, and you'll have conflicting reports about what happened. So what did happen? I have no idea. I don't know. How do you come up with a conclusion about a historical event that was in the past, that there's conflicting accounts of what happened? I'm not talking about where you have conflicting analysis of what happened, but where the facts are in doubt, the facts are in question. So could it be possible that there was atrocities committed there? Yes. Could it be possible that atrocities weren't committed there? Yes. Is there any way of us knowing? No. There isn't. So the only thing that, so people say, well, then what do you do about it? So I said, the only thing you do about it is that you make sure that in the current Israeli army regulations, and there are, that you're not allowed to commit atrocities. That's the only thing that you could do. You can't turn back the clock, right? We can't take a time machine to go back to see what happened. So we don't know what happened. Now, the bigger issue with places like Deir Yassin is that how is it used in the discourse around Israel? It's used to say that therefore, because of an event like Deir Yassin happened, Israel is an illegitimate country, right? Because let's say Deir Yassin did happen the way our greatest critics say it did. There were straight out atrocities that occurred, right? That we killed men, women, and children knowingly. Let's say the worst case thing. So that does not make Israel an illegitimate country, right? Israel's legitimacy still stands even if atrocities were committed in the war that our enemies started against us to stop us from creating a state, right? That does not mean that we're illegitimate. The United States of America is a legitimate country, even though it had slavery and it interred Japanese during World War II, and it wiped out the native population, right? It's still a legitimate country, and it doesn't mean that it's morally corrupt. Democracy is always judged by whether it's trying to improve itself. So if Israel looked at it and said, Deir Yassin was one of our greatest victories, and that's how we should conduct warfare going on, that would be something that would cause the legitimacy of Israel and to be called into question. The fact that maybe, and again, I don't know for sure, but maybe there were things that we've done wrong in the past. Of course, we've made mistakes, right? Of course, we've done things that we're not proud of, and there's things that we wish we could turn the clock back on and not do them the same way. But that doesn't take away the legitimacy of the country itself. It's very important to realize.
Was there any others that can be like factually said, like something
Right.
happened? What I heard was like Deir Yassin and other massacres that made Palestinians have to flee.
Right. Now, so okay. So now let's.
And they said exemplary massacres, like it was like.
So Deir Yassin is the top one. Deir Yassin is the one that's always used. I'm going to bring up a couple of points. Deir Yassin is the number one that's talked about the most. But what's fascinating and to keep in mind is that there were about 1 million Arabs living in Israel in 1948, or Palestine then, that left, right? That were let's put it this way, we shouldn't use the word left, that were no longer there when the independence armistice was created, okay? That they were no longer there anymore. Okay, they lived in places like Ramla and Lod and Jaffa, right? That's where these Arabs left, and they were stuck on the other side of the Green Line, what today they'll call the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. That's where they were stuck after the armistice was called. Any Arab that stayed in Israel, let's say Arabs of Abu Ghosh and Arabs in the Galil and up north in the Galilee, they were allowed to stay, right? And they eventually became Israeli citizens. But if you left, you weren't allowed to come back, right? Those are most of the Arabs living today in the West Bank are descendants of those Arabs, and there are about like 6 million Arabs living around the world who are descendants of those people. And right, so Rashida Tlaib is a Palestinian descendant who's a member of Congress, right? So her family moved over in the war, right? And the sign the Palestinians have is the sign they have a key. This is the key to my house in Ramla. I moved out. What did Israel do with those houses? They moved Jews into the houses, right? That's there's empty houses there. The Arabs, they weren't allowing back in. Now, how did it come about that those Arabs were no longer there? How did they get moved or were moved, right? So the majority of Arabs, this is a historical fact that can be looked up. The majority of Arabs left on their own accord. The Arab nations that attacked Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, announced that they want to just be able to come in and kill everybody that they see and not have to worry about if they're going to kill Arabs. So they announced that everybody should leave. Okay, so the majority of those that left on their own accord and expected to come back within 2 or 3 days after the Arab armies had wiped out this new Jewish state. Some of the Jews some of the Arabs were forced out. Right, they were forced out. That Israeli soldiers showed up at their villages or cities and said, "Get out! You must leave," and they were forced out. Okay, and it was somewhat in the middle that there were wars going on. They were just scared. Right, they were shooting on their streets, so they had to move. Okay, so those are the three categories. All three exist. The debate is the percentage numbers. So if you speak to Palestinians, they're going to say 90% of the Palestinians that left or the Arabs that left because they were forced out, right, by Israeli soldiers coming in. And if you speak to Israel, they're going to say about 70% of those were left on their own accord, 20% out of fear, and 10% were forced out. So it's all gradations. If anybody tells you that any of the three categories doesn't exist, then they're lying to you, because everybody that's honest agrees that three categories exist. Just a question of numbers.
But there weren't any exemplary massacres.
Yeah, Darius seen it was everybody was killed.
Okay, well, if there was that one, was there any others?
Not to that extent. Darius seen is the example.
Okay.
There were individual things where but one of the things that modern day progressives don't get, okay, which is that warfare, they don't get that people die in war. Okay, they think that nobody should die in war, right? War should end without any death. So when civilians die, they're like, you can't have civilians always die in war. That's the unfortunate reality of war. That's why we don't like war, right? War is not like the way the British fought wars in 1776, where they got into a field, they lined up, and then they said fire, right? And then you fire, and then whoever's left from your line advances, and you say fire again. That's not how war is fought, right? It's never been like that. And keep in mind, World War II, America took out the entire city of Dresden, Germany, right? There's tens of thousands of civilians died. That's how war happened. We dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan, right? So everybody says, how could Truman have dropped 2 nuclear weapons on civilian cities, right? Atomic bombs on civilian cities. He killed 150,000 people in an instant, right? How could he have done that? Well, the answer was because had he not done that, the Japanese would have continued attacking and millions of Americans would have died. So he took that calculation, right? That was, okay, so you could judge him in retrospect and say, no, you shouldn't have done that. But Truman's job was not to protect Japanese citizens, it was to protect American citizens. And that's how he felt that he could keep them the safest. So, yeah, but what happens today is that you have a lot of judges who, not actual judges, but people who judge warfare based on these ridiculous standards of, well, if any civilians die, that's where, Israel conducted an 11-day operation where they dropped some of the world's heaviest bombs on rocket launchers, and only 220 people died, and the estimates are that 2/3 of those people were Hamas operatives, and 67 children died, right? So we now know, bless you, we know now that 1/4 of the 67 died from Hamas rockets that fell short. So that means that Israel used some of the world's heaviest weaponry in residential areas, and were only responsible for the death of 40 children, right? So using the word only and death and 40 children sounds horrific, but that's actually a major accomplishment. There's never been any army that's fought that morally before. But if you look at any one death of a child and say that calls into legitimacy the entire operation, and to question the legitimacy and to question of the entire operations, that's absurd. Okay. Did anybody notice that there were elections in Israel and a new government was formed yesterday, and that the only prime minister that you've basically had in your conscious life is no longer prime minister? You noticed that, Brandon? You have a question about that? Or you just raising
I was just thinking about it over the past few days. What's going to change in the life of the average citizen after 4 elections and all this stuff?
So a lot will actually change in the life of the average Israeli citizen. First of all, the biggest thing they're going to do is electoral reform. So they're going to put term limits in. They're going to be doing a lot of different things like that in Israel. I think you'll see a lot of social issues change in Israel. A lot of liberal social issues that the progressive movements in America would love to see take place in America are going to take place in Israel. There's a law that changed yesterday that I can't. I thought when I saw this law change, the first law that changed in Israel yesterday was an internal Ministry of Health law. The new Minister of Health in Israel is a man by the name of Nitzan Horowitz, who's the head of the Meretz Party, which is a super left-wing party in Israel. Very secular, left-wing in terms of peace and left-wing in terms of social issues. And he happens to be a homosexual man, a gay man. And he changed the law in Israel. Wait till you hear this law, that when a gay man donates blood, he no longer has to write that he's gay. So I'm like, why in the world was that law ever on the books? So there are 80 countries that still have that law. So I was like, what in the world? What's the logic of this? So the answer is it comes down to HIV. which I also don't really understand, because HIV is not a law that's limited to homosexuals. It's also heterosexuals can get HIV. So it's like very, very strange that this law was ever on the books, but that was the first thing that changed. How many people is that going to affect? Nobody. It's a checkbox. It doesn't mean that they rejected the blood. It just means that they wanted to know. I don't even understand the logic of knowing, because I'm hoping that they check all blood for HIV. You know, not just the ones that people that admit that they're homosexual. So I don't really understand like the logic of it at all. But that is one change. It's very interesting because they're not going to be able to change too much, because the government is balanced between left-wing parties and right-wing parties. So and central parties. What's interesting is the most right-wing social party, right? Like a party that's very anti-gay. Just as an example, is the Muslim party, the Arab party. It's not just an Arab party; it's a Muslim religious party. So people have to understand. You say you call it an Islamic party, and people are like, "Not all Arabs are Islamic." No, this party is like, this is a religious Islamic party. You know, this is like the Haredi party of the Arabs. Okay, so like so that's who they are. You know, so they wanted to. I don't remember what it was. That there was something in the coalition agreement. It might have been gay marriage, that they said they're only going to join if that's off the books. They won't allow that to pass. You know, they are very, very conservative religious party, so they could not agree to that, because that's against the tenets of Islam. But the government only has 61 people. So that means one person can topple the government, especially one party. If one party gets ticked off enough, they can leave, and then we're back to the next elections. You know, so you're not going to see so much accomplished, because in order to accomplish anything, every single one of the 8 parties in the coalition have to agree, and then every one of the members has to agree inside the coalition. So all it takes is one member of the Knesset to get like really upset and be like, forget this, I'm out of here, I'm leaving the government, and now you're down to 60-60 and the government can fall.
So how did they agree to form a coalition in the first place? Like, it's still like, I just don't get it.
The one thing they all agreed on was that Bibi Netanyahu should not be prime minister. So they said, we'll come together on that. And then there were a bunch of things that they all happened to agree to. They all agree there should be term limits to the, to it. And then there's issues that like maybe 6 of the parties care about, and 2 of the parties just don't care about, so they sign off on it. They don't really care, So that's so it'll be interesting to see what they can actually pass, and what they can't pass. I'll tell you, I'm not a prophet. I don't know. I can't make predictions, but I don't see like it based on Israel's past of how how long they've lasted when they only have 61 seats. I'm not confident that this is really gonna last going forward that much, because when you only have 61 seats, any issue can really overturn it. Okay. No one has any other questions about it. I feel like maybe you guys haven't done any reading on the new government, and that's why you don't really have any questions.
Rabbi, are there any differences in opinion when it comes to like security risks in the new coalition?
Yeah, like the left-wing parties want me out of Judea and Samaria. So like one.
That's not nice of them.
Well, I mean, talk to the Palestinians, they'll think it's very nice of them. So and they don't do it because like they hate settlers. They do it because they feel that our areas are an impediment to peace, and that if only we left, there would be a peace deal with the Palestinians. I think that if only they left Tel Aviv, there would be a peace deal with the Palestinians. If you would ask the Palestinians which you want more, Tel Aviv or the West Bank, they would clearly pick Tel Aviv, and they believe that Tel Aviv is theirs. So why not? But in any case, what's interesting is that one of the major points of the coalition is that they want, in my area, Judea and Samaria, what the world calls the West Bank, there's never been a strategy of how transportation should work, meaning how highways should be built. The way that roads are built by us is that one of 2 things causes a highway or a road to be built. Either massive traffic jams, where they realize, okay, now we've got congestion here because maybe a lot of a population shift has occurred. And now like the highways that were built 30 years ago when they expected a quarter of that to people. So they have to add lanes or add an entire highway. That's one thing that initiates building. The second thing that initiates building is if Arabs have like start throwing rocks or like start shooting at a road. So then they say, okay, we should build another road that Jews don't have to drive on the roads that are getting shot at. Those are the two things, but there's never been a grand strategy of what highways and roads should look like. So one of the things, the priorities that this government has is to create that grand strategy. The Minister of Transportation, at the same time, is the head of the Labor Party, which feels that Jews should leave. So I'm not sure if all the highways are going to be like one directional towards Israel. You know, like you can't come back in. Like that's a joke. That's obviously no one's going to build one directional highways. But in any case, but that's the you know, that like, so it's very strange to come up with to have this grand strategy of transportation being put into place by somebody who doesn't believe that Jews should live there in the first place. So I don't know, maybe she's going to like fool herself into thinking that all these roads will one day be used by Palestinians and in a Palestinian state. So, and that's why she'll feel good about herself doing it. But I can also see her like just, you know, saying, okay, I'm not going to do it. So I don't know. Okay. Okay, while I have all of you here and these exciting questions, I think maybe it's time for us to take a summer break on our Zoom. How many people are not going to be near the internet over on this thing over the summer?
I'm gonna be in TJJ.
Okay, so you
Starting the 30th.
to attend. Okay, TJJ is a good thing. Okay, Rebecca, what about you?
I'm away for 3 weeks, but not till like July 21st.
Okay, and Shlomi, what about you?
I'm going on NCSY Cola.
NCSY call. Okay, so you're not near the internet. Odaya, are you going on one of these NCSY programs? She lives in Israel. Get it?
No.
And you should know there are a lot of American kids that go on NCSY Colo, which you couldn't do, Hodaya, because you're not a boy. But there are whenever I have like the NCSY Colo comes to my house in the summer, there's always like 5 or 6 kids in each group that are like, I live in Beit Shemesh. I'm like, okay, that's odd. But
I don't think I'd want to go on a trip which is mostly Americans, and I'd be like that Israeli girl that speaks English. It's just weird.
right.
I just spend time with my friends.
Okay, well, you date to whatever you'd like. Okay, and Jordan, what about you?
I'll pretty much be available all summer. I mean, I would miss 1 or 2, but I'll pretty much be on Wi-Fi.
Okay, and Brandon, I'll ask you to be polite, but we don't really care about your opinion because you graduated high school. So what do you?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I don't really count.
Right, yeah, but I would be polite and ask you. But if you don't want to even like go along with the charade, Brandon, what are you doing for the summer?
Wow, great question. I'm an NCSY advisor in Oregon for 2 weeks.
Oh, awesome, cool, very very cool. Brandon doesn't live in Oregon; he lives in Jacksonville. But that's very cool, interesting. Okay, well, in any case, this is what I think. I think we should break, but if there are any parlor meetings or chances to lobby, so then I'll put that in the group chat. And if not, we'll start up in the I think the first week in September, which might be Rosh Hashanah. So, but we'll have to see. I don't remember exactly, but I think that's what we're gonna break, and then we'll restart that. Okay. Everybody good? Okay, and there should be an APAC policy conference. There will not be an APAC high school summit, but Geller and I are thinking of creating a special trip to make up for it. So pay attention to that because that will be very worthwhile for you to go on. Okay, all the best, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Have a nice summer.
Thank you. You too. Thank you.